皆様お待たせいたしました。続きましてはアメリカのビットコイン準備金最前線の動向と実態をお届けいたします。 Thank you for waiting. Our next session is titled US Bitcoin Strategic Reserve Frontline Developments and Current Status。 それではスピーカーの方々をご紹介しましょう。 Our guest panelists are Samson Mow from Jan 3, David Zell from Bitcoin Policy Institute. The moderator is Yoichiro Sato from Wisteria House, Tokyo. Please give it up for everybody. Please come to the stage. 拍手でお迎えください。
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Samson and David. Today we are given a topic on U.S. strategic Bitcoin reserve and the current status and the future potentials. So before we start the session, I'd like to ask you both to do a self-introduction, how you become a Bitcoiner, and also I would like to ask you how you see the current political and economic landscape, why it is important to discuss this topic right now in Tokyo. So Samson, please.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Samson Mow. I'm the CEO of Jan 3. We work on nation-state Bitcoin adoption and just trying to accelerate Bitcoin adoption around the world in general. We work with governments and regulators from a top-down perspective, and from the bottom up, we developed the Aqua wallet, which is a Bitcoin and Bitcoin Layer 2 wallet, trying to empower people in the global south and bank the unbanked. And your second part of your question is why is how do you
important to discuss this topic?
Yeah, so I think the Bitcoin topic is very crucial right now simply because of the incredibly scarce amount of Bitcoin available. And I don't believe people fully understand exactly how scarce Bitcoin is. Because if they did understand, I'm pretty sure the price will be different than it is currently. But I think that's the primary driver of the urgency to accumulate Bitcoin quickly because it may be out of reach in 6 months to a year or two.
Thank you. Please, David.
Hi, I'm David Zell. I'm the co-founder of the Bitcoin Policy Institute. It's an organization that we started nearly 4 years ago to try to make the case to American officials that Bitcoin was good for US interests. We started off sort of as a blog on the internet. Now we are the largest organization in Washington, D.C., focused fully on Bitcoin. We've had the immense privilege of being able to work with some of the leading congressional members like Senator Cynthia Lummis on her Bitcoin Act, and more recently have had the privilege of being able to work with senior government officials in the White House, in the Treasury Department, on the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. Our organization published the first ever sort of white paper on an SBR a little bit before the election in November. So our team has been thinking very deeply about the sort of merits and demerits of a strategic Bitcoin reserve for the United States. And we're working, right now with Treasury Department officials on sort of budget neutral strategies for acquiring more Bitcoin. So really excited about the work that we're doing and the progress that's being made. As far as why Bitcoin is an important topic, I think the answer has very little to do with Bitcoin at all, but has everything to do with fiat currency and with just history. This experiment that we're living in every country, whether you're in Japan, whether you're in the United States, of using a money that is printed by the government. That experiment has been conducted over and over and over again for hundreds and hundreds of years. Whether you go back to Rome, to the Netherlands, to the UK, there has never been a currency that can be printed at will by humans that has not lost 99.99% of its value from all-time highs. So if you look to history, if you're in any way a student of history, you know how this experiment ends. It ends with massive, massive debasement of the currency. And so if you're a rational actor living in a fiat experiment, your incentive is to move your wealth into a hard asset to back the fastest horse, as it were. Historically, that's been gold, but I think gold is sort of a shitcoin. It's outdated. It's not fit for the digital age. Bitcoin is just the only rational means by which you should store your value in 2025. So I think it's the most important topic for anyone to be thinking about.
Thank you both. And given that David talks about his work with U.S. government official right now, so I'd like to ask David to briefly define the meaning of strategic Bitcoin reserve, and also appreciate if you talk about why the Trump administration decided to go with strategic reserve of Bitcoin, especially from policy, economic, and even national security perspectives. Thank you.
Yeah. So the first question, or first part of the question, is what is a strategic Bitcoin reserve? A strategic Bitcoin reserve is any acquisition of Bitcoin by a nation state, presumably for strategic ends. So the United States strategically stockpiles all sorts of things. We have a strategic petroleum reserve. We have a strategic cheese reserve, funny enough. We have strategic reserves of other precious metals, of munitions. So the framing, or the phrase strategic Bitcoin reserve, was sort of created to signify that Bitcoin is an asset sort of on par with anything else that the government has a strong motivation to, stockpile and to hold. As for why the Trump administration is interested in, why they created a strategic Bitcoin reserve in March and why they're interested in adding more to it, I think there are many reasons. I think one of the easiest to understand, though, is just from a perspective of fiscal prudence and diversification. We hold a large amount of gold, and Bitcoin is similar to gold, but I think Bitcoin sort of insures against a set of risks that are slightly orthogonal to gold. And so I think at the highest level, holding Bitcoin, especially for the country that sort of prints the global reserve asset, the U.S. Treasury security, I think Bitcoin can be seen as sort of a well-priced insurance policy against change to the global order. I think your point on national security is also a big motivator. One reason why, aside from the fact that I think the existence of Bitcoin and the spread of Bitcoin is increasingly seen by American policymakers as accretive to the national interest, the same way that the spread of the internet sort of spread liberal democracy by letting people speak freely and communicate freely. I think senior U.S. government officials recognize that the spread of Bitcoin, similarly, allowing people to transact freely, to divest from the currencies and economies of authoritarian regimes, is good for U.S. interests. I think policymakers recognize that many of our strategic adversaries, like Russia and India and China, are very large holders of gold. And so as we move into this sort of Bretton Woods III, into this kind of economic order that is defined by stricter capital controls, by the monetization of hard assets, if Bitcoin were to monetize more so than gold, America sort of being the largest nation state holder of Bitcoin, both as a country and as a function of its businesses and residents that are domiciled there, America wins on a relative basis the more Bitcoin grows. So I think that's sort of the main reason. It sort of could give option value for the state and sort of an insurance policy against the future, but also monetizing gold or Bitcoin at the expense of gold really helps the U.S. strategic interest and really harms the interests of some of our country's greatest adversaries.
Thank you, David. Samson, would you have anything to add, especially around, as David mentioned, other major economies or countries follow the same path, especially for EU or Japan or any other countries?
Well, there's definitely a trend of other countries looking to copy and emulate the US. So I think Pakistan has announced that they are also creating a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And I think 2 days ago, there was a legislator in the Philippines that said that they want to also create one and accumulate 10,000 coins over 4 or 5 years. So there's definitely more and more interest globally to create this type of reserve and hedge against the fall of fiat, or just to protect themselves in the eventuality that Bitcoin does become the reserve asset of the world. So this trend kind of implies that it's likely going to happen eventually, and it's just a question of who actively does budget neutral or non-budget neutral accumulation. Because so far, the SPR is really just a holding vehicle for seized Bitcoin. And they've yet to do anything significant in terms of real accumulation. But let's say the Bitcoin Act from Cynthia Lummis passes, then I think we'll start to see some real movement in the US, which will trigger other potential competitors to the US to act on, in their own best interest as well, to accumulate for their own reserves.
Understood. Thank you. So based on the discussion we have so far, many countries will likely follow the same path, but at the same time, governments are very, very slow when we compare with corporates or business players. I like to hear about any timeline or milestone. What kind of key factors would change or influence government's decision on this, and how long we need to wait and see? Either of you, if David, you would like to talk?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the timeline is going to be, but I think it's useful to sort of, bucket out the different paths that this may go down. So there are really two principal ways that the US government could acquire more Bitcoin. So to Samson's point, backing up a second, the strategic Bitcoin reserve that was created in March of this year really was just kind of drawing a new box around the Bitcoins that we already have, and saying that, it is now the policy of the US government that we will never sell Bitcoins. So we know that during the Biden administration, officials at the Marshals Service and at these various agencies that held Bitcoin, sold some of those coins to fund various programs. So what that reserve executive order did was direct every agency and kind of discrete holder of Bitcoin in the federal government to move those coins into a single place under the Treasury Department, the SBR, and made it illegal for those coins to ever be sold. Next, what the SBR did, the EO did, was direct the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department to, quote, explore budget-neutral strategies for acquiring new Bitcoin. So that phrase, budget neutral, is really not a term of art in policymaking. It could be interpreted many different ways, but I think the base kind of line assumption is that a budget neutral purchase of Bitcoin is a purchase which does not impose incremental cost on the taxpayer. So in other words, for example, selling the cryptocurrencies that are not Bitcoin that we currently hold, and using the proceeds from those sales to buy Bitcoin. So that's one sort of bucket, right? Is strategies that could be implemented rather quickly, without much deliberation. Really could just be the president could just direct the Treasury Secretary to sell all of the ETH and Ripple that we hold and buy Bitcoin, and that's actually one of the milestones that I expect to happen first. Because I think, from our conversations with Treasury officials, budget neutral sounds great, but there really aren't that many ways to buy a significant sum of Bitcoins in a budget neutral way. And they've kind of, I think for now, sort of written off the two major ways that could happen in size. One would be revaluing the gold certificates that we hold at the Fed, which are marked at a statutory price of like $40, despite them being, worth $3,000 now. So there's this sort of fiscal gilded QE kind of concept that I think has been sort of shot down by Besant. There's the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which has like a net position of 20 or $30 billion. that could in theory be used to buy Bitcoin. They've sort of shot that down as well. So I think, when you look at the suite of options that are budget neutral, I think selling the shitcoins that we hold, selling the altcoins that we hold, and using the proceeds to buy Bitcoin seems very sensible. That's very much in line with the executive order, right? It said that, it created a strategic crypto stockpile, but it said we're never going to buy more cryptocurrencies, we're only going to sell them. And then it created a strategic Bitcoin reserve and said, we're never going to sell the Bitcoin, we're only going to buy more. So I think the most kind of logical, easy purchase strategy would be to sell the altcoins, use the proceeds, and buy Bitcoin. There are probably some other ways, but the point is, in this first bucket of budget neutral acquisition from the White House, from the executive branch, I think you'd be hard pressed to come up with a scenario where that happens in any kind of strategic size. Like, we're talking about a few $100 million, which sounds like a lot, but for the US is literally, a rounding error. The second sort of way that we would see a strategic Bitcoin reserve would be, as Samson alluded to, the passage of the Bitcoin Act or something like it. As far as what milestones to watch, I mean, to your point, the ship of state moves and turns very slowly, so it's not like you'd see any surprises there. So I would just continue to kind of watch that bill, and it started off as one senator introducing a bill at a Bitcoin conference, and people thought she was nuts. Now that bill has 6 co-sponsors in the Senate. So 6% of the US Senate supports a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and I think it has close to a dozen sponsors in the House. So it's definitely early. I don't think we're going to see the Bitcoin Act passed anytime soon. But the fact that we have a bill that directs, if passed, the government to accumulate 5% of the Bitcoin supply is really massive. And the mimetic effect that that's having, the conversations that that's sparking, have been, I think, quite impactful and profound. So I would say watch for any of these budget neutral strategies, like the selling of altcoins, and pay close attention, because I think that stuff could happen very quickly without much warning. And then for the larger scale purchases, it's a very uphill battle, but I would watch that bill and see if more members of government become co-sponsors of it. And hopefully if I do my job well and others who are working on this do our jobs well, then we will see the number of co-sponsors of that bill go up and to the right.
Good. Samson, would you like to add anything? And also, I'm keen to hear your view on interaction between government's moves and market reaction, or even at the opposite side, because last year we saw ETF started, and this year the US government started strategic reserve, and maybe interaction can go further.
So far we haven't really seen that much interaction in terms of Bitcoin-related announcements, other than maybe some spikes. But it seems like the Federal Reserve is more consistent in their ability to move the market with their announcements over time. But just talking about what David was mentioning, the governments kind of have, government machinery kind of has 2 speeds. It's very slow, and then if it's an emergency, it can be fast. So that, I think, is probably what's going to happen in terms of timeline. It's going to be slow, and then suddenly when it's an emergency, then I think we'll see something move very quickly. But again, the crypto stockpile is a good indicator of temperature in the room, of willingness to act and to accumulate. The Bitcoin Act, I think it will be some time before that goes to vote and gets traction, even though we have traction. But it seems to be that the mother of Bitcoin adoption is really necessity, just like invention. And I believe the efforts around stablecoins are sort of their near-term strategy to address inflation and just the economy in general, trying to stimulate demand for T-bills and whatnot. And I think if that doesn't pan out, we might see a very quick ramp up non-budget neutral Bitcoin acquisition strategies. But one interesting thing to note is the terminology is really caught on. Like, first of all, the SBR is relatively new, right? It was around the Trump executive order. Before that, people would just call it a Bitcoin treasury or a Bitcoin reserve. But now it's the SBR, and that's caught on. The other interesting terminology is budget neutral. Engaging with other governments around the world, they're also parroting the US and saying, we're also interested in budget neutral ways to accumulate Bitcoin. So it just shows that there is a lot of global demand for Bitcoin, but not having to spend money for Bitcoin, which is kind of an odd thing, but we're on the right track at least.
I think it also shows the sort of policy leadership of the United States as well. Like I didn't know that, but it makes perfect sense that that's been your experience. And so I think to one of your earlier questions, you know, what happens if the U.S. does this? It sounds like every other country is kind of prepared to follow what the U.S. does, but maybe not overstep it. So the U.S. says we want Bitcoins, but we don't want to cost the taxpayers money. If the U.S. government buys $100 million worth of Bitcoin, Samson, do you think every other government kind of inches forward and says, okay, we'll sell whatever altcoins we have? Like, do you think there's going to be kind of a one-to-one of other countries mirroring the U.S.?
Likely, but more importantly, I believe people are waiting for a signal. And it was much in the same vein for the ETFs. So the Bitcoin ETFs, it wasn't until the SEC greenlit it and the US launched that they opened up in Hong Kong and then Australia in that order. And I think Japan is now looking towards it too. But the US does lead a lot in terms of policy and just general direction. So I think if the US does move forward with non-budget neutral acquisition, we'll see a lot of countries scrambling. But more to Yoichiro's point, the timeline, this is the really challenging part, because for a country to buy Bitcoin, it is not that simple. Like, a country does not simply buy Bitcoin. There has to be a lot of machinery put into place, laws passed, processes defined for who the custodians will be, what the process to vet custodians will be, discussions on if it would be a custodian or something more sovereign like a digital Fort Knox, where it's completely under government control, and also where they will source Bitcoin from. Which brings me to another interesting point, which is other countries will be at a severe disadvantage to the US government to source Bitcoin, simply because the markets are mostly in the US. So if Japan wanted to create an SPR, then the question is there enough Bitcoin? Because they'll be buying largely from private holders or corporate holders of Bitcoin. And if the government does telegraph their intention to accumulate a large allocation of Bitcoin, like the Bitcoin Act from Cynthia Lummis, that's saying 1 million over 5 years, right? That's 200,000 coins a year. And it's to be seen if a large telegraph buy from a nation state would actually pan out. I think the first year, they may be able to meet their target and get 200,000. Second year, maybe. But by the third year, I think other countries will have done something or have found a way to catch up. And then it'll be much harder. Because telegraphing the intention is also kind of opening the door to being front-run by other countries. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of one of the key paradoxes of the strategic Bitcoin reserve. Like, the way that you would do it, at least in the United States, in the most size, really wouldn't be strategic at all. So the way you strategically buy Bitcoin is, you know, you announce it after the fact, right? You find, and look, I think the markets are a lot more liquid and sophisticated than they used to be. I think that you can buy pretty large sums of coin without much market disruption if you're sort of very tight-lipped, you kind of are disciplined, you buy it over the course of a long period of time, you orchestrate OTC deals with old holders. You know, all it would take, though, would be very, very risky. But I think it's plausible that the U.S. could buy a material amount of Bitcoin and then, you know, do a Sailor style tweet, right? The U.S. has acquired, a Trump Truth Social post. The U.S. has acquired, X many coins at an average price of blah blah blah. Like that's really the only way that this would be strategic. The Bitcoin Act style of purchasing, there would be sort of maybe ends for which that is like a suitable strategy, but getting the best entry price on your Bitcoins is certainly not one of them. So if the U.S. just wanted to pump the price of Bitcoin, they could sort of move a bill like that through Congress. But yeah, I think the only sort of strategic way to do it would be to do it first and announce it second. And that's easier said than done.
There's a question I get a lot, which is the U.S. secretly buying right now? And I don't know about your thought on that, but I don't think it is possible. You might be able to buy a few hundred million quietly, secretly, through some special vehicle or through some existing agency. But I don't think you're going to be able to buy really large amounts of Bitcoin, at least not without significant risk, because then the question is, who is holding it? Is it some guy's Blockstream Jade wallet, or is it, like where are they keeping it? On a hot wallet? Like there's just too many questions, and it opens the door to the source of the coins too. Like if the U.S. government is buying coins, they need the coins to be reputable. It cannot be from some dark market guy somewhere on the internet, right? So I don't think you can really significantly accumulate a large amount of Bitcoin in secret.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting thought experiment. I agree with Samson. I kind of highly doubt that the U.S. government is buying in secret right now. I mean, that'd be awesome, but I sort of doubt it, especially because they're still talking about it publicly, right? Like, I think when a general rule of statecraft is like when things like this get serious, people shut up. So I don't think you would see sort of White House representatives continuing to do media hits, like talking about, oh, we're going to find ways to buy. I think that if there were sort of buying going on now, I think people would just be sort of silent. The other interesting thing is, the government just took a 10% stake in Intel recently, which is kind of a landmark departure from the political economy of the United States to date. And it sort of raises a lot of questions with respect to the SBR, right? When you have a U.S. company domiciled in the United States that holds 600,000 Bitcoins, I don't know. It's certainly, and I'm not really making a normative judgment on this, like whether it's good or bad, but I think it's now that sort of possibility is much more possible. The U.S. government could go to the open market and buy Bitcoins. It could probably also go to Michael Saylor and say, how much for 10% of MSTR?
Intel was free, wasn't it?
I don't know. I thought they paid for it.
I remember seeing that they didn't need to pay for it. It was part of Trump's.
My guess is that Saylor would drive a hard bargain. I think he would negotiate. I know that in the U.S., the law is that if you're gonna, for example, make there's mechanisms by which the U.S. government can just take a stake in a company. It has to pay a fair market value for those shares. A fair market value, of course, being determined by them. So the interesting question for MSTR would be, would the U.S. government, say that a premium to NAV is fair, right? Would they buy it at a 1x multiple of the net Bitcoin holdings? Would they buy it at market price? Would they whatever? But yeah, I think the point is given that there's a company in the United States that's holding 600,000 coins, it presents this entire sort of parallel set of strategies that especially to Samson's point of there's the sort of deliberate, slow, methodical purchasing of Bitcoin. And then there's some exogenous thing that creates an immediate urgent need. And I could easily imagine that something like the nationalization of MSTR or the strategic acquisition of some percentage of that company kind of sounds a little bit more like the type of thing that happens in that second scenario that you were talking about of oh shit, everything's breaking. We need as much Bitcoin as we can get. what's our options? Like,
It all goes to defense of the dollar, I think, and dealing with the debt, the concept of debt and the increasing debt. So a lot of things are just, they're not necessarily solutions, but they are ways to craft the message and address the problem, quote unquote. But the other interesting thing is, you know, we don't actually know how much is in the current SBR. And Secretary Bessent was on television, I think, a few days ago or a week ago, and he gave a range. He said something like it's 15 to 20 billion, but that's a huge range. You know, it's like it's either 127,000 some odd coins or 170,000 some odd coins. It's less than the normal Bitcoin number that we see for the US, which is 200 to 205,000 coins. But even of the 200 to 205,000 coins, we know that 95,000 belongs to Bitfinex and that will be returned. So if you think based on Bessent's announcement that they've sold, I don't know, pick a number, 50,000, then the US may only have maybe 40,000 coins or less, because we know that under the Biden administration, there have been additional sales.
Right. And I think that's another sort of milestone to look to, is like, if we get clearer numbers on how much Bitcoin the Biden administration sold, I think that gives the Trump administration more sort of political cover, right? To say, hey, we're not doing it was the Biden administration that, you know, engendered this radical departure. We're just kind of going back to the status quo. So I think if there's clarity that the Biden administration sold 50,000 Bitcoins, then all of a sudden buying 50,000 Bitcoins is not so radical, politically speaking. It's just a return to the mean. So I think that's another kind of milestone to watch. It's also some of the conversations that, you know, that we've had with people around the sort of scale of the U.S. government's holdings. I mean, honestly, very squirrely. Like, you know, you hear people say, and when I say people, I mean people sort of with security clearance, people with sort of in a position to know. And I get odd when you ask, like, you know, oh, well, you know, the official number is this, the unofficial number, like, I don't know, like, maybe we should go into a skiff and talk about it. Like, it's very strange. And I don't think you have to be super conspiratorial or crazy to game out some scenarios where, you know, it might be like, you know, if the CIA, for example, had a large Bitcoin position, say they'd established it very early on in Bitcoin's history, you know, maybe they're sitting on, you know, a massive, very convenient sort of black budget for whatever they want. Like, you know, just because, you know, there's some piece of paper that comes out in March that says, send the Treasury Department your Bitcoin. Would they send the Treasury Department their Bitcoin? Maybe, maybe not. Like, I think we have to keep in mind that, like, the history of the state and the U.S. government is filled with sort of scandal and with, you know, sort of different factions kind of doing their own thing despite, you know, what the president says. So there's the way the government works in theory and like in a textbook, and then there's the way the government works in practice. So I guess my sort of point here is that it's not implausible that certain factions of the U.S. government are holding material coins that are not being counted in the strategic reserve. And I do just find it odd, frankly, as someone pretty close to this issue and as an observer. You know, one of the things that was repeatedly promised by the White House was we're going to audit the coins, and we're going to, you know, they never said technically we're going to make the results of that audit public, but it was heavily implied. And then things kind of just went dark.
Public funds, it should all be public.
Exactly.
In theory.
It should all be public. So to me, like, the fact that they're being so squirrely about the number suggests that it is sort of a meaningful deviation from 200,000, whether it's sort of to the downside significantly or to the upside significantly. I have no idea. But I do just find that odd. So yeah, I think that's another key milestone to watch, is like if the government truly goes on the record and says we hold X many coins, especially if that number is lower than that 200,000 count, I think that's going to, you know, reduce the amount of political capital needed to execute a buy.
Good. Thank you. Given the time limited, can we move to discuss potentials or benefits for Japan or even for other governments, although we have already touched a little bit, but Samson, do you think Japan should also consider SBR in the future? And any challenges or difficulties based on your conversation you have so far with members or government officials? And any advice for Japanese people?
Yeah, so we've had a series of meetings, and thank you to you, Sato-san. But we've met with almost every single political party now. After this visit, we'll have met with all political parties in Japan. And the general temperature is that there is not a full understanding of the urgency or the need for a strategic Bitcoin reserve. But we are working actively to engage and inform. A lot of our efforts are really just talking about what's happening in the US, because not everyone is following what's happening with Bitcoin as closely as us, of course. But if you are following, then you are aware that the world has materially changed. There is a strategic Bitcoin reserve in the US, the largest economy on the planet. The BlackRock ETF, Bitcoin ETF is their most successful ETF period in terms of launch, volume, and profit now. You can use Bitcoin as collateral in the US mortgage system. Banks cannot discriminate against Bitcoin holders. So the world has really changed, and I don't think politicians everywhere are fully informed as to exactly how much it has changed, because every government is dealing with some crisis in some form or another at any given time. So it's just getting that to the top of the pile and getting that to the people's attention and having them understand it. But as I said when we first started this talk, the timeline by which any country can accumulate a significant sized Bitcoin reserve is getting shorter and shorter by the day. Maybe there is a year left. And given the amount of bureaucracy and red tape needed to do something, the time to strategize and execute on that was maybe 6 months to a year ago. So I'm hopeful that Japan can start on this path, and I think it is absolutely necessary. There are a lot of economic and macroeconomic reasons for Japan, the economy being one, declining birth rates another one, and I think Bitcoin can solve all of these problems because Bitcoin provides an economic base by which people can plan for the future. And I'm hopeful that Japan will adopt a Bitcoin strategy.
Good. Just final question for David. Do you think Japanese government or even municipality should follow the same path, and what would the benefits or reasons?
Yeah, I think there's a prevailing fear with respect to nation-state adoption that the purchasing of Bitcoin represents weakness, that it represents insecurity in the domestic fiat currency. My message to Japan and to the rest of the world is to look at the example of the United States and recognize that the intent to and follow through purchasing of Bitcoin is literally the opposite. It is a symbol of strength. It is something that you do from a position of strength. And so I think the biggest message is that the acquisition of Bitcoin need not accompany a fear for the stability of the domestic currency. It need not be a symbol of weakness or of concern. It's something that, it's like insurance, right? You have insurance on your house or your car, and you don't expect your house or your car to be destroyed, but you have that insurance policy because it's the prudent thing to do. I think that Japan and other nations should consider the acquisition of Bitcoin as much the same. It is option value for the future. It is a well-priced insurance policy, and it is something that will make international investors more confident in the domestic economy and the fiscal position of the country, not less confident.
Good. Thank you very much. That's so insightful, and also thank you very much for joining us. And please give hands to the great speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to our speakers. We would like now to ask you to come to the center of the stage for a quick group photo. Smile for the camera. Thank you very much. Please give our speakers a round of applause. ありがとうございました。